Momentum did not fail randomly. It failed at a specific structural location. And that location was defined before the move began. The March 17th U.S. session anchor formed between the mid-region of the March 16th U.S. session and the upper boundary of the March 15th Asia session. This is not a breakout position. This is a transition zone. When a session anchor forms between prior boundaries instead of outside them, the environment is not expanding. It is negotiating. Price moved higher after formation. It broke above the March 16th U.S. session box, and it tested the upper boundary of the March 16th Asia session. This is where most participants begin to expect continuation, because movement is visible, but structure did not confirm relocation. The move reached a prior boundary, but it did not establish distance beyond it. And this is the first critical condition. Distance is not created by touching a level. Distance is created by holding beyond it. That did not happen. And when distance fails to hold, price returns. Now the environment shifts. Because failure does not remove structure. Failure reinforces structure. The March 17th Asia session formed almost directly overlapping the March 16th U.S. session. This is not separation. This is compression. When session anchors begin forming in the same location, structure becomes denser, and density changes behavior. Price no longer travels cleanly. It begins to rotate. Inside the same region, the Asia session broke below its own lower boundary, then returned back inside. This is not direction. This is instability. A break that cannot hold. A return that cannot extend. This is structural friction. And friction reduces usable distance. Now the key shift occurs. Price breaks below the March 17th U.S. session boundary and continues downward, not to a random level, but to the mid-region of the March 15th Asia session. This is where the earlier structure still exists. So what actually happened here? Not a breakdown, a relocation into older structure. And this distinction matters, because if you treat this as direction, you chase. If you treat this as structure, you locate. This is where MRM's first axis matters. Time, right-pointing arrow session. Sessions are not time zones. They are structural anchors. And here, every move is interacting with those anchors. Now add the second axis. Volatility, right-pointing arrow compression. Compression was already forming before the move. Overlapping sessions created density. Density created instability. And instability leads to false extension. The expansion attempt failed because compression was still active. This is why understanding structure changes execution. Because you are no longer reacting to candles. You are responding to conditions. And the condition here is clear. Structure tightened first. Then movement failed. Now we move from observation to execution. Because structure is not for description. It is for decision-making. And decision-making in this environment requires precision. Let's reconstruct the sequence. The March 17th Asia session overlapped with the prior U.S. session. This created a compression zone. Inside that zone, price attempted to extend higher, but it failed and returned. Then it broke lower. Now this sequence creates a very specific execution framework. When compression forms between session boundaries, continuation trades lose reliability. Because continuation requires distance, and compression removes distance. So what replaces continuation? Boundary-based execution. Not direction-based, boundary-based. This is where the third axis becomes critical. Location right-pointing arrow position. Where is price relative to moving averages and prior session boxes? During the overlap, price was not cleanly above or below structure. It was inside. Inside means neutral. Neutral means reduced conviction. Now look at what happens next. Price breaks below the March 17th U.S. session and moves into the March 15th Asia structure. Now location shifts. This is no longer inside the overlap zone. This is inside older structure. And older structure behaves differently. It has memory. It has interaction history. So execution changes. Here is the actionable framework. If price returns into a prior session box after failing to hold above it, then the upper boundary of that box becomes a rejection zone. Not because it is resistance, but because it failed to hold above it earlier. Failure defines behavior. Now apply this to the current structure. If price attempts to move back toward the March 17th U.S. session boundary and fails to hold above it again, then that becomes a repeat rejection condition. This is not prediction. This is conditional execution. Now consider the opposite. If price begins to hold above that same boundary and interaction frequency decreases, then compression is resolving, and distance becomes available again. This is how structure defines opportunity. Now bring in the fourth axis. Pressure right pointing arrow slope. The 20 Bollinger Bands expanded aggressively during the March 17th Asia session, but the lower band expanded more steeply. This tells you something critical. Pressure is asymmetric. Downward pressure is stronger than upward support. Then on March 18th U.S. session, the upper band begins to close, while the lower band remains expanded. This is not neutral. This is directional pressure without confirmation. And that combination produces unstable continuation. Moves extend quickly, but fail to stabilize. This is exactly what we observed. Now add the fifth axis. Liquidity right-pointing arrow trigger. Where does liquidity activate? At boundaries, not in the middle. So during compression, the middle is noise. The edges are actionable. This is why execution must shift from chasing movement to interacting at boundaries, because boundaries define where liquidity responds, and liquidity is what creates movement. Now everything comes together, because structure is not just what happened, it is what is available next. The March 18th U.S. session broke below multiple session layers. It moved through the March 17th U.S. session, through the March 15th Asia lower boundary, and reached toward the March 12th U.S. upper boundary. This is a multi-layer relocation. But again, relocation is not confirmation, because confirmation requires persistence, and persistence has not yet formed. Now the March 18th Asia session forms, right at the March 12th U.S. boundary. This is critical, because now a new session is forming directly on a prior structural level. This creates a new decision zone, and this is where execution becomes very clear. If the Asia session continues to hold inside this boundary, and interaction remains tight, then compression is reforming. This means distance will remain limited, and execution should remain reactive, not anticipatory. But if price begins to move away from this boundary and holds that distance, then structure is shifting again. Now let's translate this into concrete trading behavior. There are three usable conditions. First, return to prior boundary without holding. This is rejection. Execution, fade the move back toward structure. Second, repeated interaction at the same boundary. This is compression. Execution, reduce size, trade shorter distance, focus on edges. Third, clean, move away from boundary with persistence. This is expansion. Execution, allow distance, hold longer, reduce early exits. These are not opinions. These are structural states. And each state defines a different execution style. Now step back. What is the environment right now? Multiple session overlaps. Failed persistence above. Expansion attempt downward without stabilization. And new compression forming at a lower boundary. This is a transition environment. Not stable expansion. Not clean compression. Transition. And transition is where most mistakes occur, because it looks like movement, but behaves like structure. So the question is not direction. The question is condition. Which side begins to hold first? Because the side that holds distance defines the next phase. Until then, structure dominates behavior. And execution must remain conditional, not reactive.